This is green-white hexproof auras, or as some people call it, Bogles. And this deck, it's been around in Modern for a while. A lot of the same cards that it's always been playing. It's dropped off in popularity actually recently. Unclear as to exactly why, but this deck does prey on control decks, and control's a little bit less popular, but I still think that Boggles is a good choice in that it's an explosive deck. It's hard to interact with. People are playing more removal spells like Fatal Push, cards like that. You're happy if your opponent's loading up on interaction because you can just win with a Boggle and some auras. That's how you're going to win most of your games anyways. So the more removal your opponent has, the better. And it's a 2-color mana base. We've got a bunch of green and white lands here. Only 19 lands total because lots of 1-mana spells. So you're able to dump your hand fairly quickly. You can operate off of 2 lands, no problem. So there's 4 copies of Horizon Canopy as well. And the nice thing about the Horizon Canopies is that if you get a little bit flooded, you can just cash them in and for a fresh card. Yes, they can deal you some damage, but normally, because you have various ways of gaining life, if you lose a little bit of life from your Horizon Canopies, it doesn't affect you that much. And then there's 1 copy of Dryad Arbor. So the Dryad Arbor can be found off of Windswept Heath as well, because it is a forest, and it's an alternative win condition. So there's only 12 creatures in the main deck, and that means that sometimes you're a little bit creature-light in some hands, and Dryad Arbor is a card you can fetch up and load up with some auras. Or you can use it in some matchups if your opponent's playing Liliana of the Veil or other Edict effects. Sometimes in response to that, you can fetch the Arbor and protect the creature that is more important if you have a hexproof creature in play at that point. So the mana base is pretty good. Normally you have access to both your colors, no problem. We have 8 1-mana hexproof dorks. So Slippery Boggle and Gladecover Scout may not seem like much, but they're actually the most important creatures in the deck. You want one in every single hand. You want to be able to go turn 1, Scout, or Boggle, and then all of a sudden all of your auras are live. You can just start throwing them on to the turn 1 creature and go to town at that point. So you're really hoping to have one. If you don't have one in your opening hand, then probably going to want to mulligan to at least 6 to try to find one, depending on what the matchup is. Sometimes the other creature in the deck, which is Core Spirit Dancer, if your opponent doesn't have removal for it, okay, that card is great. But you do have to be worried that your opponent might have removal for your other creatures, and that's why the Scout and the Slippery Boggle are so important. Those are the 2 creatures that removal doesn't really matter against. So 4 copies of Path to Exile as well. That's the only kind of interactive card we have. Everything else is an enchantment or a creature. But Path is just a good card. It can get you out of some tight spots. So we are playing 4 of those. And then we get into the actual auras in the deck. So you're going to see a variety of different effects on the auras. Some will give you trample, some will let you draw cards, some will give you lifelink, vigilance, first strike, you name it, reach. Your auras can get you there, even protection from creatures. So there are a lot of different ways that you can not only boost up the power and toughness of your creatures, but you can also provide various effects for them. So we've got 6 Umbras. So Hyena Umbra and Spider Umbra. So both give +1/+1. One gives first strike, one gives reach. I think the first strike and reach part of the card, most of the time, it's not super important. Reach is good against flyers if you're up against maybe a deck like Affinity and you want to block an Inkmoth Nexus, something like that could be relevant. Hyena Umbra, the first strike. Sometimes, very rarely, you're up against a creature with the same power as your hexproof threat. So, gone with the split between those Umbras, 3 and 3. But the most important part of the Umbra is that they have totem armor attached to them. And so what that does is the totem armor means that if your Boggle or your Core Spirit Dancer were to die, you can just simply get rid of your Umbra and keep the creature. So it is another protection against removal, even mass removal. If your opponent goes, say, Damnation, you can just say, all right, goodbye Spider Umbra, goodbye Hyena Umbra, and you still have your huge creature at that point in play. So the Umbras are quite important to the deck. Some versions have more than 6. I'm going with a 3-3 split. Then we've got Ethereal Armor, which is amazing in the deck because it's a 1 mana, say, +3/+3/+4/+4, and you can go on because it's +1/+1 for each enchantment you have in play, as well as First Strike. And you can see how many enchantments are in this deck. You've got a ton of them, so Ethereal Armor just gets better and better and better the more enchantments you are able to play. Then there's a single copy of Spoon, so that's a pretty new addition to the deck. And it can give a creature flying, so having some type of evasion is pretty important in some matchups because your opponent can just clog the ground and try to chump block. So having some way to either trample past your opponent or fly, in this case, is nice. And then, of course, Spoon can come back from the graveyard, which, while rarely relevant, it does happen. 1 copy of Spirit Link, and you'll see some 1-ofs here. The Spirit Link, it's another way to gain life. So if you're against a deck that's trying to race you, maybe it's Burn, maybe it's Revolt Zoo, you really want to be able to have at least one form of lifelink. Spirit Link is supplemental to the Coronets and Unflinching Courages. There's 1 Keen Sense. Basically, you throw it on one of your Bogles or your Gladecover Scouts, and then you can draw cards, draw into more gas. So if you deal damage to an opponent, you are able to then draw a card. And then Rancor, the +2/+0 and trample for 1 mana. It's just a great rate on a 1 mana enchantment. And beyond that, if somehow your opponent is able to, say, maybe play an engineered explosives and, deal with your Boggle, at least you're going to get explosives for 1 rather, which is one of the better cards against this deck. You're still going to be able to get your Rancor back if somehow your opponent maybe has a Back to Nature, maybe has one of those really good enchantment removal spells to deal with Rancor. You're going to get it back. You can still potentially reload. Maybe you have sandbagged a creature you can play and then put the Rancor onto it and still have game from there. Then we've got the Core Spirit Dancer. So this is the other signature creature in the deck. So 2 mana for a 0/2. For each aura attached to it, it gets another additional +2/+2. So as soon as you start putting auras onto Core Spirit Dancer, it just gets insanely large, and the opponent it's pretty much dead in a turn or two as soon as you get a Spirit Dancer out and start throwing enchantments onto it. The other nice thing about it is that whenever you play an aura, you're cantripping. So you're able to go, okay, draw a card, draw a card, draw a card, and make sure that you continue to have gas. But you can either play an enchantment on the Spirit Dancer, or maybe you decide to diversify your auras and start playing them on the Bogles. Either way, the Spirit Dancer, if it lives and stays in play, is amazing. Okay, now we've got Daybreak Coronet. So this is one of the signature enchantments of the deck. So It provides +3/+3, First Strike, Vigilance, and Lifelink for only 2 mana. The only part about this that you need to be aware of is that you need to have an aura already attached to the creature that you're playing the Daybreak Coronet on. So it is going to be huge when you put the Coronet on it. Just make sure there's an aura or even 2 auras on the creature you're enchanting, because one thing you do need to be aware of, say you have an Ethereal Armor on one of your 1-mana Hexproof guys, then you play Daybreak Coronet. If your opponent then deals with one of the enchantments, so say your opponent goes Abrupt Decay your Ethereal Armor, your Daybreak Coronet is then going to fall off because there's no longer an aura onto it. So just be aware there's some ways to interact with it, but it's the highest power level of all of the auras. It's the most important one. Spirit Mantle is another way to provide evasion. Maybe you're playing against Affinity or whatever the deck may be that has a lot of creatures. Being able to attack through your opponent and not even worry about them being able to block is really nice. And then another way to gain life, we have Unflinching Courage. This one also gives you +2/+2 in Trample, but it's a 3-mana spell, so it's the most expensive spell in the deck. And so the deck, it's pretty straightforward. Play your creatures, play your auras in game 1 at least. So once you move on to the sideboard, sometimes you're going to dilute your deck a little bit, maybe take out some auras, and in certain matchups like against combo decks or against decks with discard, you're really going to want these sideboard cards. Okay, so Leyline of Sanctity is really important against any deck that has discard, because you're vulnerable to your opponent just going Inquisition or Thoughtseize away your hexproof creature, and then all of a sudden you may not have any threat to play. So the Leyline of Sanctity is really nice against Liliana Edict effects and against the discard, as well as against burn. Just being able to prevent burn spells coming at you. So the Leyline of Sanctity is just a good card in general. In a lot of matchups, it's super important. Now, you do need to have it in your opening hand for it to be relevant, so just be aware of that. There's 3 copies of Gaddock Teak. So this is a card that many people forget is even in the format, but it is a really good hate bear type spell. And it can provide another way to pressure your opponent. It's a creature, of course, that is capable of attacking. But some of the combos decks in the format, maybe it's Ad Nauseam that you're playing against. They're going to have a very difficult time with Gaddock Teak without being able to cast Ad Nauseam. It turns out that deck is pretty bad. So that's one example of a time when you're just going to want Gaddock Teak, and it can just win you the game by itself. Then we've got our primarily artifact removal, but sometimes you're against a deck with enchantments as well. So 3 copies of Stony Silence, 2 copies of Seal of Primordium. So we know that we're boarding in Stony Silence against Lantern and against Affinity, of course. The Seals come in against those decks, but they also come in against decks with Blood Moon and maybe some other random enchantment hate cards that you might need an answer to. And if your opponent plays a card like Ensnaring Bridge, you really want to have the Seals. So we need at least 5 artifact removal spells against those decks, I think, because they are some of the tougher matchups for the green-white hexproof deck. Then we've got 1 copy of Spirit Link. So this comes in against the aggressive decks, the burn decks, etc. And then Rest in Peace. I like this against any deck with Tarmogoyf or Snapcaster Mage as a way to really disrupt the graveyard. It turns out against the most popular deck in the format, the Jund Death Shadow deck, Rest in Peace is very good, because not only does it stop Tarmogoyf, but it stops Traverse the Ulvenwald as well. So it is really effective there. So there'll be matchups where Rest in Peace can just win you the game as well. So you want all of these cards to be high impact after board. And then there will be other matchups where you just don't need to board much at all because the matchup is already reasonable on its own. So this is the Hexproof Aura deck. I like this list, and I think we will be seeing this deck continue to have a reasonable presence in the modern format moving